Tomlin. It's just rainwater.
No! Someone moved it.
You think you know what an old man in rubber boots is capable of. Diane Holloway thought she knew too. She stood on her podium that night, microphone in hand, telling 300 of my neighbors that I was a bitter, paranoid retiree who didn't understand progress. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that I had spent 30 years reading the exact kind of documents she was about to get buried under. By the end of that meeting, she wasn't the president of anything anymore. She was just a woman standing alone on an empty stage, watching her own numbers get read back to her by the man she tried to drown out. But let's back up, because this story doesn't start with a microphone. It starts with water. My name is Walter Kessler. I'm 64 years old. I spent 3 decades as a civil engineer for the county, most of it specializing in stormwater systems, drainage grading, flood mitigation, the unglamorous plumbing that keeps a town from sliding into its own basement every time it rains. It's not the kind of career that makes for interesting small talk at parties. People's eyes glaze over the second you say the word culvert. But it teaches you something most people never learn. Everything that looks solid on the surface is usually held together by decisions somebody made on paper years before you ever walked into the room. My wife Carol passed 2 years ago. Cancer, the slow kind that gives you time to say everything you need to say, which I'm grateful for, and also the kind that leaves you sitting in a house built for two long after there's only one of you left in it. After the funeral, after the casseroles stopped coming and the phone stopped ringing, I found myself needing something to do with my hands. So I threw myself into small projects, fixing the fence, refinishing the deck she'd always wanted stained a different color, planting tomatoes in the exact spot she used to plant them, mostly because I couldn't stand looking at that patch of dirt sitting empty. I never expected the quietest project of all my own backyard to become the thing that upended an entire subdivision, exposed a small-time fraud, and put me in a room full of strangers pointing at a hand-drawn map like it was Exhibit A in a trial. But that's exactly what happened. It started on a Tuesday morning in late September, the kind of gray, drizzly day that doesn't feel dramatic at all. Nothing about it announced itself. I walked out with my coffee to check on the tomatoes I'd been babying all summer, half out of habit, half because tending something alive still felt like the closest thing I had to company most mornings. Instead of soil, I found a lake. My whole backyard ankle-deep in brown water, the tomato cages tipped sideways and half submerged, the plants themselves drowned and blackened at the roots. This was the 3rd time in a month. The first time I chalked it up to a freak storm, one of those late summer downpours that dumps 2 inches in an hour. The second time I got annoyed, muttered something about clogged gutters, made a mental note to check the downspouts. The 3rd time I got curious. And curious for a man who spent his career reading blueprints is a dangerous thing to become. I called the HOA office that afternoon. A pleasant young woman named Steph took my complaint, typed something into a system I could hear clicking on the other end of the line, and told me she'd flag it for the maintenance committee. I asked when I might hear back. She said cheerfully that response times varied. That was the entire conversation. No follow-up call came. No inspector showed up. No email, no letter. Nothing but silence. The kind of silence that starts to feel less like an oversight and more like a choice the longer it goes on. So I did what I used to get paid to do. I went and looked myself. I pulled on the same rubber boots I used to wear inspecting culvert sites for the county, grabbed a tape measure and a small notebook out of habit, and walked the property line behind my fence, past the drainage swale that had been there since the subdivision was built back in the 90s. I remembered swales like that one from the original site plans I used to review back when developments like Fairview Ridge were still fresh proposals crossing my desk. A shallow, grassy channel designed to carry stormwater away from home foundations and out toward a retention pond built specifically to hold it. Simple. Effective. The kind of infrastructure nobody thinks about until it stops working. What I found stopped me cold. The old concrete culvert that used to carry runoff out toward the retention pond behind the tree line had been capped with fresh mortar, still pale compared to the aged concrete around it, recent work weeks old at most, and running off at an angle I didn't recognize from any plan. I remembered a brand new length of black corrugated pipe, shinier than anything else back there, cut behind 6 backyards, mine included, in a direction that made no engineering sense unless you already knew where it was supposed to end up. Someone had rerouted the water recently, and whoever did it hadn't bothered to check or hadn't cared where it would land once it got there. I took photographs from several angles. I measured the new pipe's diameter with the tape measure from my garage, wrote the number down alongside the date, Another old habit that never quite left me. I told myself I was probably overreacting, that there was some boring explanation routine, maintenance nobody had bothered to mention to the neighborhood. I've been wrong about plenty of things in my life. I was about to find out I wasn't wrong about this one. I met Diane Holloway 3 days later at the neighborhood fall mixer, one of those community building events with a folding table of lemonade, a banner that read Fairview Ridge Together We Grow, and a bounce house for the kids that nobody was using because of the drizzle. She was exactly what you'd expect from a woman who'd spent a career selling houses before she started running the HOA that governs them. Sharp blazer, sharper smile, a handshake that felt less like a greeting and more like a transaction being closed. "Walter, right? You're the one with the water issue," she said before I'd even finished introducing myself. News travels fast in a subdivision of 400 houses. Faster still when the person asking questions used to work for the county. "I am," I said. "I was hoping to see the updated drainage plans. Whatever's been done back there, it's pushing water into yards that never used to flood, mine included." Her smile didn't move an inch, but something behind her eyes recalculated quick and practiced the look of someone doing math she didn't want anyone watching her do. "We're in the middle of an exciting community improvement initiative," she said, the phrase gliding out like she'd rehearsed it. "I promise you, everything's being handled by licensed professionals. I'll have someone follow up with you directly." Nobody followed up. A week after that mixer, I noticed a white pickup truck idling near the mouth of the cul-de-sac most mornings around 7, no logo on the doors, just a magnetic sign that read, Fairview Ridge Grounds Patrol, stuck crookedly to the side panel. I'd never seen a truck like that in the neighborhood before, not in the 30 years the subdivision had existed, not even when the association hired a landscaping crew twice a year to trim the common areas. I mentioned it to my neighbor across the street, an older widow named Ruth, who'd lived in Fairview Ridge since it was first built back when the streets were still unpaved and the trees were saplings staked with twine. "New thing," Ruth told me over the fence one evening, arms crossed against the evening chill. "Started a few months back. Diane says it's for security, keeping an eye on vandalism near the tree line." "I always thought it was strange they only ever seemed to park near your end of the street, Walter. I didn't think much of it at the time. I should have." 2 days later, I found a laminated card tucked under my windshield wiper, no name attached. Just a printed warning that unauthorized foot traffic near association drainage infrastructure is subject to fines and possible legal action. I hadn't been anywhere near the swale that week. I'd been inside, mostly going through old boxes in the garage, trying to find a spare downspout extension I thought might help with the flooding on my own. 2 weeks passed. 2 more storms rolled through, each one a little heavier than the last, the way early autumn storms tend to be. My foundation, 30 years old, and never once a source of trouble, started showing a hairline crack along the north wall, right at the spot where the water pooled longest and deepest. I stood out there one evening with a flashlight, running my fingers along that crack, feeling something tighten in my chest that had nothing to do with the cold. I filed a formal written request through the HOA's online portal, asking specifically and in plain language for engineering drawings of any drainage modifications made in the past 12 months. I know how these systems work. A request like that submitted in writing, time-stamped, creates a paper trail. I wanted that trail. I wanted it badly enough that I saved a screenshot of the confirmation the moment I hit submit. What I got back 5 business days later wasn't drawings. It was a violation notice. Cease and desist, unauthorized excavation on association-maintained property. Apparently, when I'd walked the swale with my tape measure and taken a handful of photographs, a neighbor's video doorbell 3 houses down had caught grainy footage of me crouched near the pipe joint, and somebody had decided that constituted digging. I'd actually just brushed back some wet leaf litter with my hand to get a clear look at the seam between the old concrete and the new corrugated pipe. But that particular detail hadn't made it into the notice. $3,000 in fines. A warning typed in bold that any further interference with community infrastructure improvements would result in legal action. Legal action over a tape measure, a flashlight, and a handful of wet leaves. A few days after that, a second envelope arrived, this one from a firm calling itself Whitfield and Cross Attorneys at Law, printed on heavy cream letterhead, meant to look intimidating. Cease and desist, more formally worded this time, threatening a defamation suit if I continued to spread misinformation about the association's infrastructure decisions to my neighbors. I hadn't said a single word to anyone outside my own backyard at that point, which told me something important, something I sat with for a long while that night. Somebody was already nervous about people talking. You don't send lawyers after silence. You send lawyers after the fear that silence is about to break. I sat with that letter for a long time that night, turning it over on the kitchen table, remembering something. An old mentor of mine used to say back when I was a junior engineer fresh out of school, sitting through my first contentious planning hearing. He told me that people who are telling the truth usually just get louder when you push them. People who are hiding something send letters instead, because letters are safer than a conversation where somebody might ask a follow-up question they can't answer. I hadn't thought about that man in probably 15 years. I thought about him a lot over the following weeks. That's when Priya Nair showed up at my door. Priya lived 2 houses down, mid-30s. A software engineer who worked from home most days moved in with her husband about a year earlier. I'd waved to her from my driveway a few times, exchanged the usual pleasantries. You exchange with neighbors you don't really know yet. She stood on my porch that evening holding her phone like it was something fragile, glancing back over her shoulder toward her own house, before she spoke like she wasn't entirely sure she should be there. "I heard you got a notice," she said, voice low. "We've had flooding too, twice this fall." I didn't want to say anything before because we just bought the house closed in the spring and I didn't want to be the new person on the street making trouble right out of the gate. "What changed your mind?" I asked. She hesitated, then turned her phone toward me, thumb already swiping to a saved photo. "My husband flies a drone, just as a hobby, mostly sunset shots over the neighborhood. Last month, he caught this without even meaning to." The photo showed the tree line behind the subdivision from above and beyond it, a stretch of cleared, freshly graded earth that hadn't been there the last time either of us had looked closely, which admittedly was never. A construction sign small enough to miss entirely from ground level stood near the edge of the clearing. "Ridgeline Golf coming soon, private membership community." I stood there in my doorway for a long moment, doing the kind of math a lifetime of engineering trains into you, whether you want it to or not. A private golf course needs water features, ponds, irrigation, the whole decorative apparatus that makes a fairway photograph well for a brochure. Water features need a reliable continuous source. And somebody somewhere had apparently found a very convenient one, already flowing right through the middle of a subdivision that already held legal rights to it, just waiting to be quietly redirected. "Do you know anyone who used to sit on the HOA board?" I asked her. "Anyone who left recently, especially somebody who left in a hurry?" She thought about it, scrolling back through some mental list of neighborhood faces. "There's a guy, Harold Finch, corner house on Birchwood, the one with the blue shutters. He was on the board. I remember hearing he resigned kind of suddenly last spring, right in the middle of his term, which struck people as odd at the time. My husband said he seemed shaken up about it whenever it came up." I found Harold 2 days later raking leaves alone in his front yard, moving slower and more carefully than a man his age should have needed to. When I introduced myself and mentioned I had some questions about a drainage project the HOA had approved, his rake stopped mid-stroke, blade half buried in a pile of wet leaves he never finished collecting. "Come inside," he said quietly, glancing toward the street, the same way Priya had glanced toward her own house. "Not out here." His hands were unsteady around a coffee mug he never actually drank from as he told me the story, speaking slowly, like each sentence cost him something. 8 months earlier, Diane had called an emergency board session with almost no advance notice to the general membership, a scheduling shortcut that, as I'd later confirmed, technically violated the association's own bylaws, though nobody on the board pushed back on it at the time. She told them there was a critical maintenance issue with the old culvert system, something vague about erosion risk near the retention pond, and that a temporary reroute needed board approval that same night to prevent imminent damage. She had drawings with her professional-looking stamped with what appeared to be an engineer's seal, though Harold admitted nobody had actually verified whose seal it was. "We voted yes," Harold said. "I didn't think twice about it. I've known Diane 6 years, trusted her completely the way you trust somebody you've sat across a folding table from at 100 board meetings." His voice cracked slightly on the word trusted. "A few months later, I started hearing rumors secondhand that she had some kind of financial stake in the golf development going in behind the tree line. I asked her about it directly, right to her face at a board dinner. She laughed it off, told me I was listening to neighborhood gossip, made me feel foolish for even bringing it up." He set the mug down without ever having taken a sip. But I couldn't sleep right after that conversation. Something about the way she laughed. I resigned 2 weeks later. Told everybody, told myself that I just wanted less stress at my age. That was a lie. I knew something was wrong and I didn't have the stomach to fight her on it. So I walked away instead. Would you say that to the county on the record if it came to it, I asked. Harold looked at his hands for a long time, the silence stretching out between us until it felt like its own kind of answer. If it means fixing this, he finally said yes. I should have said it 8 months ago. I called Ray Odom that same night sitting at my kitchen table with the lights off in every other room in the house, the way I do most evenings now. Ray and I worked together at the county for almost 20 years before he moved over to the Planning and Infrastructure Division a few years before I retired. If anyone still had access to the original recorded easements for a subdivision as old as Fairview Ridge, it was going to be him. Walter Kessler, he said when he picked up, and I could hear the grin in his voice even through the phone. You retired specifically so you'd never have to look at a drainage plan again, as long as you lived, and now you're calling me about 1 at 9 at night. Some habits don't retire, Ray. 2 days later, I sat across from him at the county records office, a windowless room lined with filing cabinets that smelled like old paper and toner, watching him pull a thick, dust-lined folder from a box that clearly hadn't been opened in years. Inside was the original recorded drainage easement for the Fairview Ridge subdivision, dated back to when the development was first platted, the kind of document that gets filed away and forgotten the moment the ribbon gets cut on a new neighborhood. Ray ran his finger down the page, mouthing a few phrases to himself, then looked up at me over the top of his glasses. This entire stormwater conveyance system, the culvert, the swale, the outfall running to the retention pond, it's a dedicated public drainage easement, he said, tapping the page twice for emphasis. Recorded to the county, not the association. The HOA has maintenance responsibility for surface landscaping around it, mowing, keeping it clear of debris, that kind of thing. Full stop. They do not have the authority to reroute, cap, or structurally modify the actual conveyance path. Any change like that requires an engineering review and a formal permit application filed through this exact office. And has anyone filed a permit application in the last year? I asked, already fairly certain of the answer from the way the room had gone quiet. He typed for a minute at the terminal beside him, scrolled, typed again, frowning slightly at the screen. Nothing, he said finally. Not one filing under that parcel number, not this year, not last year. Whatever's back there behind that tree line, it was done without county authorization of any kind. He sat back in his chair. That's not a bylaws violation, Walter. Bylaws violations get you a strongly worded letter and maybe a small fine at a board meeting. This is a public infrastructure violation. That's the kind of thing that gets an association's insurance dropped, and it's board held personally liable, individually, not just as an organization. He pulled a second document out of the same folder, this one more recent, a zoning application filed under a different name entirely. Ridgeline Land Holdings, LLC, requesting a conditional use permit for a private recreational facility on the parcel directly behind Fairview Ridge. Ray tapped the registered agent line at the bottom of the page. Take a look at who filed this. The registered agent's address matched a P.O. box downtown. It took Ray another 20 minutes of digging through the county's business registry database before he found what he was actually looking for: the LLC's original formation documents filed 18 months earlier, listing 3 managing members. 2 names I didn't recognize. The third was Diane Holloway, listed under her maiden name Diane Pruitt, a detail I doubt anyone at that fall mixer would have caught even if they'd been looking directly at it. There it is, Ray said quietly, sliding the page across the table toward me. That's not gossip anymore, Walter. That's a filed public record. She has skin in this game, and it's sitting right here in black and white for anybody who bothers to look. I spent the next several evenings doing what I used to get paid to do for a living, except this time for free at my own kitchen table with a mug of coffee going cold beside me. I pulled up the original site plan Ray had let me photograph, sketched the pre-reroute flow path and the new one side by side on a fresh sheet of drafting paper. I still had tucked away in a closet and ran the numbers on where the diverted water was actually ending up once it left that shiny new pipe. It wasn't just my yard, and it wasn't just Priya's. My calculations, conservative ones, the kind I'd have signed my name to professionally, showed at least 14 properties sitting downstream of the new route, all of them quietly absorbing runoff that used to flow harmlessly into a retention pond engineered decades earlier specifically to handle it. Priya and I spent one evening walking the block together, going door to door, not to stir up outrage, just to ask a simple, almost boring question. Has your yard been flooding lately more than it used to? By the end of the night, we had 11 separate households confirming standing water foundation seepage, dead landscaping, or in one case, a sump pump that had been running nearly nonstop since August, and the homeowner had simply assumed needed replacing. Quiet people, mostly the kind who blame the weather or blame their own bad luck, with grading never once suspecting the actual answer, was sitting folded inside a filing cabinet at the county records office the whole time 3 miles away, gathering dust. One of those 11 households belonged to a young couple, the Ostranders, who'd had a baby just 4 months earlier. Their finished basement, the nursery overflow room, they'd spent their entire summer renovating, had taken on nearly 2 inches of water during the last storm. They'd assumed it was a foundation. Waterproofing failure had already gotten quotes from 3 separate contractors, one of them recommending a full French drain installation that would have cost them close to $11,000. Mrs. Ostrander cried a little standing in her doorway when I explained what we'd actually found behind the tree line. Not from sadness, from the particular kind of anger that comes from realizing you nearly spent your savings fixing a problem that was never yours to begin with. Another house belonged to a retired schoolteacher named Voss, a quiet man who'd simply stopped using half his backyard, moved his garden beds to the higher, drier side of the property, without ever once complaining to anyone, assuming it was just something that happened as a yard aged. When I told him what I'd found, he didn't say much. He just nodded slowly, like a piece of a puzzle he'd stopped trying to solve had finally clicked into place on its own. The annual HOA meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday. Diane's own newsletter, glossy and cheerful, had promised a major community announcement about the upcoming Landscape Enhancement Initiative, complete with a small teaser image of a pudding green under a setting sun. I read between those lines just fine, and I suspect by that point so did a handful of other people on my street who'd started comparing notes. The night before the meeting, her attorney showed up at my door personally, a tall man in an expensive wool coat that seemed a size too formal for a suburban front porch, standing there like he was doing me some kind of favor simply by being present. "Mr. Kessler, I'll be direct," he said, not bothering with a greeting first. "If you make any public statements at tomorrow's meeting that could be construed as defamatory toward Ms. Holloway or the association, we will pursue damages aggressively. This is your only warning." I looked at him for a moment, and behind him, out past my driveway, I could hear my sprinklers kicking on automatically, and beneath that fainter, the low, persistent gurgle of water, still not draining properly from the low corner of my yard, the same corner that had drowned my tomatoes back in September. "I don't plan on saying anything that isn't true," I told him, keeping my voice level. "You should probably worry less about what I'm going to say tomorrow night and more about what's already sitting written down at the county office, filed and dated. That part isn't going anywhere no matter how many letters you send me." He didn't have a response ready for that. He just stood there for a second, adjusted his coat, and walked back to his car parked at the curb. The community center was packed by 7 o'clock the following night, folding chairs set up all the way to the back wall, standing room along both side aisles, the kind of turnout the HOA usually only gets when there's a rumor about rising dues. Diane stood at the podium in a cream blazer, hair pulled back, a projector screen glowing behind her with a rendering of manicured fairways rolling toward the horizon. A clubhouse with tall glass windows catching an imaginary sunset, a water feature shimmering peacefully in the foreground. "Ridgeline Golf, a new era for Fairview Ridge." The slide read in a confident, oversized font. "Tonight," she said, her voice bright and thoroughly practiced, carrying easily to the back row without the microphone even needing much help. "I'm thrilled to share an incredible opportunity that will raise every single one of our property values by as much as 25%. Through a private partnership, Fairview Ridge will soon border one of the most exclusive golf communities in the entire region, and every homeowner here stands to benefit." Scattered applause, uncertain in places. A few neighbors leaned toward each other, whispering, some nodding along with the excitement, others frowning at the numbers being thrown around so casually. I stood near the back, with a rolled-up printout tucked under my arm, waiting the way you wait for the right moment in a courtroom, though I'd never actually stood in one professionally in my life. Only ever. The county planning boards, which I was about to learn, aren't so different in the end. "Are there any questions?" Diane asked, scanning the room with the easy confidence of someone who'd never once been told no in a room quite like this one. I raised my hand and started walking down the center aisle before she'd even fully called on me, my boots quiet against the linoleum, the printout unrolling slightly under my arm as I moved. I wasn't loud. I didn't need to be. 30 years of standing in front of planning commissions teaches you something people rarely appreciate until they see it in action. Quiet, specific facts carry further in a room than shouting ever will. "Ms. Holloway, I have a question about the drainage system behind Birchwood and Larkspur. I said, unrolling my sketch flat on the table in front of the podium. The side-by-side comparison of the original flow path and the new one drawn to scale, every measurement labeled in my own handwriting. This is based on the county's recorded easement map from when this subdivision was originally platted. It shows the entire stormwater conveyance system as public infrastructure under county jurisdiction, not association property. Can you tell this room when exactly the association filed for a permit to reroute it? The room went quiet in that particular way. A room goes quiet when 300 people simultaneously realize something real is happening in front of them. That's a maintenance matter. Diane said, her smile tightening almost imperceptibly at the edges, one hand drifting toward the edge of the podium as if to steady herself. I'm not going to get into engineering minutiae at a community meeting, Walter. This isn't the venue for that. It's not minutiae when 14 households are absorbing water that used to go somewhere else entirely. I said, turning slightly to address the room instead of her directly. I have measurements. I have photographs time-stamped. And I have a friend at the county records office who confirmed in writing that there is no permit on file for any modification made to this system ever. I let that sentence sit in the air for a moment before continuing. Which means whatever's back there behind the tree line, whatever that golf course is planning to draw its water from, it was built on water that was never legally yours to redirect in the first place. Priya stood up from her seat near the front, her voice steady despite the nervous energy I could see in the way she gripped the back of the chair in front of her. Our yards flooded twice this fall, standing water for days both times. We didn't know why until Walter started asking questions and knocking on doors. Another neighbor stood, an older man I recognized vaguely from the mixer. Then another, a woman with a toddler asleep against her shoulder. Not shouting none of it, just quiet, tired confirmations, one after another, the exact kind of testimony that's far harder to dismiss from a podium than a single angry voice ever could be. Diane's composure cracked visibly at the edges, now a flush creeping up from her collar. This is a coordinated smear campaign, she said, her voice rising for the first time all evening. Mr. Kessler has been trespassing on association property for weeks, digging up infrastructure that isn't his to touch. I have the video doorbell footage your own violation notice was supposedly based on, I said, holding up my phone, the same grainy clip already queued up. I was clearing wet leaf litter off a pipe joint with my bare hand. There is no shovel anywhere in this footage. There is no excavation. I'd invite anyone in this room right now to watch it themselves and judge for their own eyes. That's when Harold Finch stood up near the middle of the room, his voice unsteady at first, but growing firmer as he spoke, the way a man's voice does when he's finally saying something he should have said months earlier. I was on the board when this reroute was approved, he said. Diane called an emergency session with almost no notice. She told us it was urgent erosion repair, showed us drawings with what looked like an engineer's stamp on them. I voted yes because I trusted her completely. I found out afterward, secondhand, that she has a financial stake in the golf development. This water is now apparently feeding. I asked her about it directly. She laughed it off and made me feel foolish for asking. I should have pushed harder then. I'm pushing now. You could have heard a pin drop on carpet in that room. At the back, a man in a gray sport coat I didn't recognize. I later learned his name was Marcus Vance, the developer behind Ridgeline Golf, quietly stood and slipped out through the side exit without a word. Nobody stopped him. Nobody needed to. His retreat spoke plainly enough for itself, and I watched at least a dozen heads turn to follow him all the way to the door. A man near the front, I hadn't noticed before, seated quietly with a folder resting on his lap, the entire meeting stood up and identified himself as a representative from the County Infrastructure Office, invited earlier that week by Ray at my request, in case things escalated the way I'd suspected they might. I want to inform this board and this community, he said, his tone calm and entirely procedural, the kind of voice that carries more weight in its flatness than any amount of shouting could, that the county will be opening a formal investigation into unauthorized modification of a recorded public drainage easement effective immediately as of tonight. Any further construction activity connected to this reroute needs to cease before another shovel touches that ground. Diane stood alone at the podium after that, the golf course rendering, still glowing behind her in cheerful, oblivious color, suddenly looking like exactly what it had always been underneath the polish and advertisement nobody in that room wanted anymore. You've ruined an incredible opportunity for this entire community, she said to me, her voice tight now, quiet enough that only the people nearest the front could actually hear it over the rising murmur of the crowd. No, I said. I just put the water back where it belongs. For a moment, nobody moved. Then, from somewhere near the middle of the crowd, Ruth the widow, from across my street, the one who'd first mentioned the unmarked patrol truck to me over the fence, stood up leaning on her cane and asked in a voice that carried more clearly than I expected from a woman her age. "Diane, is it true you filed those LLC papers under your maiden name? Because I've got a copy right here that a friend at the courthouse printed for me this morning, and I'd like you to explain it to this room if you don't mind." That seemed to be the moment something in Diane finally gave way completely. She didn't answer Ruth's question. She gripped the edge of the podium with both hands, looked out at 300 faces that had over the course of about 11 minutes gone from applauding her slideshow to sitting in stone-cold silence, and said nothing at all for what felt like a very long time. The silence itself became its own kind of answer, the way silence often does when there's genuinely nothing left to say that wouldn't make things worse. Somebody near the back called out, not unkindly, just tired, "Are we still voting on the golf course tonight or what?" A ripple of exhausted, humorless laughter moved through the room, and that more than anything I'd said with my printout or my measurements seemed to be the moment the meeting truly ended, even though nobody had officially adjourned it yet. The weeks that followed moved faster than I expected, faster than any part of my career at the county ever moved. The formal investigation confirmed everything Ray and I had already pieced together over those late-night phone calls and folder searches, an unauthorized reroute of a public drainage easement, no permits filed at any point, no engineering review on record anywhere, and financial statements eventually surfacing subpoenaed by the county attorney's office that showed Diane held a direct ownership stake in a shell company tied to Ridgeline Golf Development. HOA reserve funds, it turned out, had also been quietly funneled toward consulting fees paid out to that very same shell company over the previous year. A detail that turned the story from a zoning dispute into something closer to outright fraud. She was removed from the board within the month by unanimous emergency vote, and the association's insurance carrier opened its own separate inquiry into personal liability, which, as far as I know, is still working its way through the county attorney's office as I record this. The golf development stalled out entirely once its water source was cut off by county order, the graded earth behind the tree line, left sitting exposed and unfinished, slowly growing back over with weeds. Last I heard, Marcus Vance had quietly pulled his investment out of the whole project and moved on to some other unlucky township that hadn't yet had the good fortune of a retired drainage engineer living inside it. The drainage system itself got restored under direct county supervision, back to its original engineered path. The black corrugated pipe dug up and hauled away, the old capped culvert reopened. Ray asked if I'd be willing to consult on the restoration project unpaid, purely because nobody currently on his team had 30 years of hands-on history with this exact kind of system the way I did. I said yes without needing to think about it for very long. It felt good, honestly, holding a set of blueprints again for a reason that actually mattered, standing out there in work boots, directing where a crew should dig, feeling useful in a way I hadn't felt since Carol got sick and everything else fell away. There was a small moment during that restoration work that stuck with me more than almost anything else in this whole story. The crew hit the old original culvert, about 2 feet down, still perfectly intact under all that fresh mortar. Someone had troweled over it exactly the way I remembered it from decades earlier. One of the younger guys on the crew, maybe 25, asked me how a pipe could just sit there hidden and forgotten for months without anyone in an entire neighborhood noticing. I told him the truth. Most people never look down. They look at brochures, at rendered fairways glowing under a fake sunset, at promises about property values going up 25%. Nobody thinks to ask what's actually running underneath their feet until the day it floods their tomatoes. I want to be honest with you about something because I think it matters more than the golf course, more than the fines, more than any single piece of what happened at that meeting. I could have gone further. My lawyer, yes, I did eventually hire one, mostly to handle the fine dispute and the foundation damage claim, told me plainly that I had solid grounds to pursue a fairly significant personal claim against Diane, directly given the documented foundation cracking and months of stress that came with it. Part of me wanted to, I won't pretend otherwise. Part of me wanted her to feel in some concrete financial way exactly what those months had felt like from where I was standing in my own flooded backyard. I didn't do that. Instead, at the next general meeting, once the immediate dust had settled and a temporary board had been installed to oversee things, I stood up and asked for one thing: not money beyond covering the actual repair costs, not a punishment stacked on top of whatever the county was already pursuing through its own channels. I asked that Fairview Ridge establish a permanent independent community oversight committee, residents, not board members, holding real authority to review and approve any future infrastructure changes before a single shovel ever goes back into that ground again. No more emergency sessions called with no notice. No more decisions made quietly in a room without the actual people who'd end up standing ankle-deep in the consequences afterward. Harold Finch was the first person to volunteer for that committee, raising his hand before I'd even finished explaining the proposal. I think it mattered to him being part of fixing something instead of just carrying around the quiet guilt of having missed it the first time. Priya joined too not long after. Watching her go from the nervous new neighbor to anxious to file a complaint to someone standing up in front of 300 people telling the truth about her own flooded yard without flinching. That's the part of this whole story I find myself proudest of, if I'm being honest with you. Prouder of that even than the moment I watched Diane walk off that stage. My backyard is dry now. It rained hard 2 nights ago, the kind of heavy drumming storm that used to turn my tomato bed into a swamp by morning without fail. And I walked out today with my coffee expecting the worst out of old habit. Instead, I found dry grass, just a touch of dampness at the low corner near the fence, exactly the way a well-graded yard is supposed to look the morning after rain. Nothing dramatic about it at all, just water going where it was always meant to go in the first place. I'm sitting on my back steps right now recording this, watching the light come up slow and gold over a yard that finally drains the way any competent engineer would want it to. It's a small thing in the end when you break it down to its parts. A pipe, a permit that was never filed, a woman who assumed wrongly that nobody left in this neighborhood would ever bother to check. But I've learned something over 64 years, and especially over these last 2 since Carol passed, and the house got so quiet I had to go looking for reasons to get up in the morning. Sometimes the biggest fights in life aren't about grand principles at all. Sometimes they're about something as small and unglamorous as where the rainwater goes after a storm. And sometimes the quietest man in the room, the one everybody assumes is just some cranky old-timer annoyed about his lawn, turns out to be the only person in the whole subdivision who actually bothered to read the paperwork all the way through. So here's my question for you, and I mean it honestly, not just as a way to end a video. If you found out someone in your own life was quietly redirecting something that belonged to everyone, water-land trust doesn't much matter. What, just to enrich themselves behind everyone else's back? Would you fight it alone and quiet it first the way I did, gathering proof before you ever raised your voice? Or would you go loud from the very beginning, the moment you first suspected something was wrong? Tell me in the comments below. I read every single one of them, usually right around the time my coffee's gone cold on the back steps. I still think about Carol's tomato patch, sometimes sitting out there now with new plants. She never got to see roots sunk into soil that finally drains the way it's supposed to. She used to tell me I worried too much about things. Nobody else noticed a slightly uneven grade in the yard, a downspout angled a few degrees off, the kind of details most people walk right past without a second glance. I used to laugh it off, tell her that was just the engineer in me, unable to switch off even on a Sunday afternoon. I don't think she'd laugh it off now. I think she'd say it was exactly that habit, the one she used to tease me about, that ended up saving 14 backyards on this street, including our own. Ruth still waves at me every morning from across the street, cane in one hand, coffee in the other, and every time it rains hard, now she calls out the same joke across the yards between us. Still dry over there, Walter? And every time so far, the answer's been yes. This is Walter Kessler, signing off from a backyard that finally drains the right way again. Stay grounded, stay sharp, and always, always ask to see the paperwork before you believe anyone's rendering of the future.